Welcome to the Future of Field Service podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Today, we are going to be hearing a very cool as a service story, which is the story of Koolmill. I'm excited to be joined by Alec Anderson, who's the Managing Director of Koolmill Systems. Alec, welcome to the Future of Field Service podcast.
Thanks, Sarah. Nice to be here.
Good. Thanks for being here. Okay, so I'm excited to share your story with our audience because there are a couple of really interesting aspects to it. And we were introduced by James Galloway at BDR Thermea, who was on the podcast not too long ago. And I'm really glad that he suggested I connect with you and that you agreed to join me here. So before we get into the Koolmill story, tell our listeners just a bit about yourself and your background.
So yeah, how did I end up in rice milling and doing machinery as a service? That's a good question. I started off as a marine engineer when I left school. I was a qualified marine engineer, but that was a dying trade. So I went back to university as a mature student. During my vacation between second and third year, I went to work for a local company for a summer vacation job for 12 weeks. Became a final year project. I joined the company and I bought the company. And here we are now. Rice was got the hook into me there somehow.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So let's explain to our audience. So tell everyone what Koolmill is and what industry you're in, because obviously our audience reaches across a variety of industries. So you're definitely going to have plenty of people here that are not familiar with the rice industry.
And that's not an unusual story. Rice is a huge global industry. It feeds half the world every day, but it's not known for its as a service opportunities. Koolmill is a small family-owned business based in the UK, and we've developed a novel disruptive technology, a paradigm shift, if you like, in milling technology. And effectively, we're trying to transform a global food system, move it from a wasteful current position into a more sustainable future position. And that's really depends on doing things differently, both in the physical sense and then also in the business model sense.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the competitive differentiation that Koolmill has. Before we do that, though, being that our audience won't necessarily understand sort of the market trends in the rice milling industry, just from a very high level, explain what some of those, pressures, challenges, and opportunities are.
Yeah, so rice is a very conservative industry. So after 8,000 years of rice processing, we are the third generation in technology. And the current mechanized machines that are abound today were introduced around about 160 years ago and have evolved over that time, but effectively they're all based on those early machines. So rice has a number of problems. There's enough rice to feed around about 600 million people is lost each year from farm to fork. And that's due to poor storage, drying and processing. And we can help address the losses in processing. And that's the estimated losses around $127 billion a year, something like that. So these are massive numbers and we need to do much better. Mm-hmm.
So there's an opportunity to improve the technology, which will reduce waste, right? It is one big area of opportunity. Can you also talk a little bit, and I think we'll get into this more later, but just to sort of set the stage for folks, when it comes to the organizations that are milling rice and where that happens and how it happens, there's some aspects of the industry that make it possible for huge corporations to do that and leave a lot of people out of the realm of possibility, right? So can you kind of explain the landscape from that perspective?
Yeah, so the current state of the art in the industry, there's probably around about 50,000 large millers globally, and they are very highly capital intensive, not necessarily digitalized, but quite automated in many instances. But to run that kind of operation, you need lots of money to buy it in the first place. You need lots of rice to keep it running, and you need a huge amount of infrastructure and power to support it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are around 1.5 million SME processors globally who don't have access to those three requirements. So they're kind of locked in to using antiquated and wasteful equipment that they've made. In fact, we were in Nigeria earlier this year and they were running machines that were made in the 1870s, still driven by diesel. So they're kind of locked into what they have, or if they do replace, they replace like with like because they don't have access to this high performance, state-of-the-art modern equipment. And we aim to try and change that.
Yeah. Okay. I did a horrible job of setting that up for you, but you did a wonderful job of explaining it. So there's opportunity in the sense of within the industry, there's a lot of waste. And so there's opportunity both in the machines and in the process to minimize that waste, which will of course help us feed more people in the world, right? Then from a competitive landscape, you have these large corporations that can afford the most modern equipment, or if even, a couple of generations more modern than the 1800s, right? But anyone that's at the small and medium size that is attempting to play in this space is kind of, boxed out just based on the cost of the equipment itself. And so Koolmill is disrupting the industry, both in the sense of offering a machine that meets the needs of reducing waste, and then also offering a new business model that equalizes the ability for companies to compete and to produce. Okay. Did I explain that correctly?
Yeah, that's you've got it. So basically, I think maybe a better way to explain it is these large mills are large and you can't scale them down and retain the level of performance. They're just not viable. Now, one of our unique points is that we can scale down without loss of performance. So whether we're milling at a ton an hour or we're milling at 100 kgs an hour, we have the same performance. And that's revolutionary in the industry. So basically, I think probably three aspects to Koolmill. One is reduction in power, which is obviously very critical right now. So we're looking at upwards of 90% reduction in power. We're looking at producing more food from the same input from the harvest, and increasing the value of that output because there's a higher quality. So we have a quantitative improvement in quantity, and we have a qualitative improvement in the quality of the output, which is higher value. And that all builds to better revenues for these smaller producers and also for the growers.
Okay. So perfect. So the machine that Koolmill has developed improves those three areas. And when you talk about quality, we're talking about nutritional content of the ultimate output of the rice, right?
Because another aspect of Koolmill, we call it Koolmill because we mill cold. We mill cold because we don't waste the power which comes out as heat in a conventional machine. There is some evidence emerging that the cold milling retains more of the micronutrients. So that then produces potentially a more nutritious food product. Also, our brand that we produce is very clean, very pure, and doesn't deteriorate after milling. So that enables that to be valorized into, again, a human food ingredient rather than as currently mostly goes to food for animals because it's basically gone rancid. So these are all things that increase the value creation.
Okay. And so those are how the machine itself is a competitive differentiator. Let's talk a bit about the decision to leverage the as-a-service business model and how that is also a competitive differentiator and a real change in the rice industry. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, this, because I guess we hadn't heard the term servitization before. And what we found when we did hear that term was we'd actually been doing it for many years. We just hadn't been charging for it. So we've been providing the machinery, providing the engineers, providing the consumables. And that was really necessary because of the development of the machine had to be in a rice mill because of the quantities of rice that we needed to do that. We spent a lot of time working with large customers, trying to sell them a machine that we didn't understand that they didn't actually need because they already had the best of what was already there. And then we started to look at the smaller users who had the need, but we found there's no point in having great technology if nobody can afford to buy it. And we had two primary barriers. One was a perceived technology risk. We're a small company with a novel technology. Nobody knows us. Nobody knows our technology. And that creates some reluctance.
Mhm.
And also we were perceived to be a high capital cost, which none of these are true, but the perception is harder to argue than the facts. So we became involved with the Advanced Services Group at Aston, and we started to work on this pay-as-you-mill service, or the machinery as a service business model, very similar to Rolls-Royce Power by the Hour, is where we've evolved to now, where we guarantee hours in exchange for a fixed fee. So that offers these small operators cost certainty. We have the technical risk; they know what's going to cost them, and it takes away the need for capital cost as well. So it's an enabler, an empowerment. It empowers these small producers now to compete on price and quality with the large producers.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Before we do, I want to talk about, you brought up to me 3 aspects that were key to making the as a service model work. So the first is connection to the machines. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the whole service model is basically underpinned by connectivity, digitalization. And clearly, if we're going to guarantee a certain number of hours per month, it's important that we understand what's actually happening on the machine, that we can work preemptively if things are going wrong to mitigate any downtime, and to maximize value. When you move to a service model, you're really moving away from the conventional transactional sales, which is a confrontational business model. I want lots of money, you don't want to pay me any money, and we try and meet somewhere in the middle, and you never see me again once I've got your money. Whereas the service model is really based on a very much a strong collaborative long-term partnership where both parties are aligned in the outcome, either successful or not successful, hopefully successful.
Well, and to your point, that you mentioned earlier and just now, there's risk sharing, right?
Yeah.
So that helps you in terms of eliminating or negating that perception that's out there. What is this new innovative thing? Could be great, might not. I'm going to just stick with what I know, right? So when you say, yeah, but listen, we're not asking you to pay us this huge upfront capital investment. Try it out and see if it works for you, right? And we'll share that risk. I mean, this is an area of moving to as a service that is really, I think, a huge opportunity, but it is an area that existing businesses, that have a legacy are very, very uncomfortable with, right? Because it's just completely different, right? So but there's, no risk, no reward, I guess is what they say, right? And so for you, it's been beneficial to share in that risk, to introduce something different, to, help these companies find a new way of working. So sorry, I just wanted to point out the risk part is a part of this, that for a company that's moving to this model, there is no way around that, right? If you're guaranteeing an outcome, there's no negating that risk. Like there's no way to do that without accepting some risk. And that's just part of this that we need to get past as an industry with companies that are, going in this direction. Okay, so sorry, I interrupted.
No, but I think just picking up on the risk point, yes, the risk is there. There's always risk. Things will go wrong. With the best will in the world, things go wrong. The question is, how do you deal with that risk? How do you write your contracts to deal? And again, if you have this strong collaborative partnership, so say for instance, if we had a customer with 5 or 6 machines, we may put 7 or 8 machines in, so that any time a given number of machines is working. Nobody knows your machinery or whatever you're making better than you do. But a lot of manufacture right now is designed for manufacture. How can we reduce the cost of manufacture? How can we reduce the materials? How can we reduce everything to make it as cheap as possible? We're trying to do a cost plus offer. We take the opposite view and move to a value creation. So if I can look at the value I can generate from a machine over its life rather than just selling it once, can I change the way I design that machine? So design for service. Can I design it in a modular way so that anything that fails on a machine can easily be changed? As we already touched on, digitalization, the ability to remotely monitor, capture data, to pick up at an early stage things in data that a human being wouldn't be able to detect, and to make proactive management rather than reactive management, which is where lots of companies are at the moment. And I think if you were in a traditional industry that's already selling equipment, it's probably a bigger change than it is for us, because we came in clean. We weren't selling anything. We're a new technology, so it's easier for us to start. But I think you have to think about the creation of value. How can you create that value? How can you capture a share of that value? And if that means redesigning the machines so that they can have a longer life with more service, and I think the world is moving away from the disposable, buy it, scrap it, get another one.
Right.
If you can design machinery that has a longer life and it can be upgraded through its life, I think there's great value there.
Well, there's great value in the sense of, like you said, you're moving into a relationship, or for you, you've created a relationship. I understand it's different context here because you're not moving away from a legacy, but a lot of our audience is, which is why I'm bringing up some of these points, because it's you can imagine having done this from fresh, how hard that is, right? So,
sure.
But when you create this partnership, right? And you are now moving away from how do we do it fastest, cheapest, and make the most money up front, to how do we create the most mutually beneficial working relationship for the long term. You build the machinery different, which helps you in servicing it and guaranteeing the outcomes, which helps your customer. But there's also a huge environmental impact, right? Because the additional investment that is required to create machinery that is intended to last longer is something that in a traditional model, no one's willing to accept the cost of, right? And so this allows organizations to, really transform the way that their operations are affecting the environment without, forcing themselves or their customers to accept that cost, right? I mean, they both are, but that's because you're moving into a model that makes that far more feasible, right? So I think that's really interesting part of the discussion too, is, there's another benefit here, which is to the environment, and moving away from that consumable mindset, moving away from just, turn and burn, create cheap, sell it. We don't care what happens after that, right? So that's a really interesting aspect of this as well.
So I think our machines are designed not to be scrapped, but they're designed to come back and be remanufactured. So we want to minimal, there is no end of life cost, because theoretically there should be no end of life, but it's minimal in that remanufacture. You want to minimize the amount of materials that have to be recycled. I think, just to pick up on your cost point, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because it comes back to the cost, focus on cost reduction rather than value creation. If I'm going to build something at a cost and then I'm going to put a markup on it and sell it to you, it's an issue, because the higher the cost, the more difficult it is for you to buy. If I, on the other hand, I'm not selling you that, then it becomes less, the cost of the initial machinery is less of an issue. It becomes an asset finance question now. And where I would argue is, forget the cost of the machine. What is the value that machine's going to create over its next 5, 10, 15 years of life? And when you look at it from that perspective, the cost of the actual physical build is generally insignificant. So one of our machines may cost 10, 15, 20,000 pounds to make, but over its life, it's going to process 50, 60 million pounds worth of rice. So the cost versus the value is really the key driver, and it's really changing that focus, because right now everybody's focused on, let's get the cost down.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And here's what I want to ask you. So, you brought this up when we chatted the first time, which is you have to educate people, and in this context, customers, that productivity is not only about reducing cost, but increasing value, right? So we're programmed to think increased productivity means reduced cost, but increased productivity can also mean increased value. Now, you're not battling an internal legacy, right? That you have to overcome with what Koolmill is doing, but you are still battling a legacy mindset in the companies that you're selling to. So how have you shifted that narrative?
Slowly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the answer. I think, as I said, we work in a very, very conservative industry. And I would say our challenge right now is not a technical challenge. It's really a culture, a mindset. It's changing the perceptions and how people think about. I mean, and if you think about it from their perspective, here's this small company from England coming and telling us we've been doing it wrong for 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's a lot to take in. And there is another problem, I think, in that at your sort of intermediate management level, their power base is based on the knowledge of the existing technologies. And when you come with a new technology, it's very disruptive, it's highly digitalized. I think there's a fear there that the younger generation will pick up that new technology more quickly, and that will devalue their power base, if you like. So you have to work very constructively with these people that could be the blockers, the saboteurs, to try and make them the hero of the story rather than the villain of the story. But it can be very challenging. And I guess if you've already got an established supplier-customer relationship, then changing that barrier or getting through that barrier is going to be probably harder than it is for us.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, you're able to come in as a fresh take, right? Hey, listen, we don't work together, but let me tell you about this. I'm not saying that's not hard. But one of the biggest objections or roadblocks that I hear from organizations that maybe recognize the potential of as a service, but are struggling to understand how they could get there is, well, our customers aren't going to be willing to pay for that. Our customers aren't going to be willing to allow us to connect and implement remote service because they pay us for hours on site. Our customers aren't, and it's because they haven't figured out how to change that dialogue and what goes into having that conversation constructively, right? And it isn't just about figuring out what goes into it. I mean, there's a lot of factors here. You said, I said, how have you handled it? You said slowly, right? So there's a lot of patience that has to be at play here. And I think it's really interesting that you bring that up. I've been in this space for, 14-ish years, right? And I get asked all the time, what's new? What's cutting edge? What's the next big technology, right? And I always say, I think, like you said, the technology is there. Okay. There is capability in technology accessible to organizations today far beyond what they are prepared to use. So we should not be focusing so much on AI and, what's next. And, we should be talking about the cultural and people and mindset shifts that are preventing companies from making use of what exists today. So when I think about where are we going over the next 5 to 10 years, I'm always asked for predictions. I hate predictions, but that is where the change comes in. And the reason that we're, as media or as, thought leaders still talking about the same concepts that we started talking about 10 years ago is because you're talking about foundational business transformation that takes a lot of time because there's so many layers to it. So I think it's a really good point that, you're not tied to that legacy as the owner of Koolmill. And that makes your remit maybe a teeny bit easier than companies that are. But overall, we all need to understand this isn't just a vision and a strategy that you put in place and boom, you go execute. And in 6 months or 12 months, you are an as a service business, right? It takes time, and we can't allow ourselves to become discouraged or think or, not believe in the power of the business model just because it's not easy to get there, right? So what do you think about that? That was a lot of words. I'm sorry.
No, I think
Yeah.
you're right. It's look, we live in a very fast world. Fail
Mhm.
fast, move on. I don't have a problem with that. Just define fast. So for us,
Mhm.
100 years is fast in rice milling.
Right.
But it does take time. And also, I think, look, if you're in a transactional sales model where I make a product, I want my profit, I want to sell it to you, often that's where the story ends.
Mhm.
What do you do with my product? How much value does my product create for you? How can I enhance that value? How can I capture my share of that value? And so, one of my customers said to me, look, I like your machine, but the price has to be fair. And I said, yes, fair to who? Fair to you or fair to me or fair to us both? He said, well, just charge me what it's worth. And I said, well, it costs you about $750,000 then for a machine. How many do you want? And he wasn't so keen then. So
Mhm.
but you have to understand, or maybe think about things from a different perspective. If you're delivering something to a customer, what value are you creating for that customer?
Mhm.
Do do the skills and knowledge that you have, and perhaps by adapting your product, by adding extra features to that product, can that create more value for them? If you don't understand your customer and how they use the product and how they create value with your product, then it's very difficult to justify a service model. But if you have that in knowledge and you have that cooperation, so I guess the key aspect here is finding that initial customer to work with who you can be
Mhm.
very close, very transparent.
Mhm.
We're very open with our customers. We'll show them what it costs to make a machine. Everybody asks me,
Right.
what's a machine cost? I go, it doesn't matter. It's not relevant.
Mhm.
It's how much will it earn you is a much better question.
Right.
So there's the challenge. Now, again, I think go back to what we said earlier, much easier for us because we're starting from scratch, much
Yeah.
more difficult where you have established practices and if it isn't broke, don't fix it. That's a saying
Mhm.
here in the UK, and
Mhm.
people like to just do what they've always done. There's no thought required.
Right.
But
For
the
sure.
margins or the additional revenue potential is significant. And,
Mhm.
again, it comes back to that capture the value, capturing your fair share of the value.
Mhm. I think the point about transparency is a really good one too, because if you were having those conversations and your answer stopped with, it doesn't matter what the cost of the machine is, what matters is this, you know, you're not resolving that objection as successfully as if you say, well, I can tell you the cost of the machine doesn't matter, what you can earn with it does, but it costs X, because you're not hiding anything. You're
No,
not trying to get one over on them, right? And so that's another part that I think is a big mindset shift in how this is sold though, is that value creation conversation and the shared risk, but it's also the honesty, right? Like we're very accustomed to, these negotiations and, don't show your hand and, and this is just, it's different, right? And if you can be upfront about, yeah, the machine only costs this and we're charging you this, but what you can do with it is this. And believe in that value proposition, then you can start a real conversation versus trying to seem
yeah,
that you're hiding something or whatever.
that's key. But I think trust is the word there.
Mhm.
You have to build that trust, and that again takes time.
Yeah.
And so we're lucky that we've been doing this a number of years now, and we've developed very strong relationships both in the supplier. So we don't have customers and suppliers; we have partners. In our
Right.
supply chain and partners in our end users. So
Yeah.
it is really that commitment to that partnership. And I think again, we're a small company, so it's easier for us. Everybody's on board with the whole concept, and that's all they've ever known in the company.
Mhm.
So if you were in a conventional existing company with a conventional product, it's really important that this is driven from the top down. You can't
Mhm.
push it from the bottom up. It's got
Mhm.
to be a commitment, and it's got to be a genuine commitment, not just
Yeah.
a dressing.
Yeah. For sure. So one of the things that I really, really like about your story, Alec, is when we chatted the first time, you referred to this as your ability to create a more virtuous cycle. Okay. And so talk to us about, how you see the as a service business model and what Koolmill is doing with it as a way to equalize competition among the really, really large rice milling companies and the small and medium size. Tell us a little bit about, what you're doing there and the way you view that.
So in terms of the virtuous circle, there's a number of things. One is so we have three pillars. There's economic, there's a social, and there's a environmental. So right now, rice is one of the largest polluters in the world. It's equivalent to aviation, about 2.5% of all greenhouse gases, and 10% of all methane emissions come from rice. So one of our is about valorization of these waste products. So the bran already we talked about can be made into a human food ingredient. Straw and husk can be used to make power, which can power a mill, which can provide 24/7 power to a local community from a waste material. And the rice mill produces high value employment, which means that people can now actually buy the electric that's now available to them, unlike solar mini grids, where they don't have a job. They can see people with light, but they don't have money to buy that light and power. So that's the one aspect. In terms of the environmental aspect, obviously by not wasting rice, that avoids the waste of the resources gone into growing that rice. By reducing the power demand, that's a massive benefit. And also the burning of the straw, the methane from the degradation of the straw. But perhaps in terms of building the social capabilities, so if I can, we call it rural industrialization, where we can use that rice mill as a focal point, as a employment generator, as a means of creating and retaining value in a local community. So rather than a rice farmer right now maybe getting 25 cents a kilo for their rice, if they could turn that into a viable mill product, it'd be worth $1 a kilo. So we could transform their livelihoods. So I think the SDGs, we would say we address 16 out of the 17. If we can put one on a submarine, we might get 17 out of 17. But so this is really a transformative technology. It can transform this global food system. And that's really critical because by 2050, it won't be 3.5 billion people rice is feeding, it will be 6 billion. Asia has a lot of issues right now in terms of land stress and water and weather events and contamination. So we don't have enough rice. I think the FAO say we have to increase rice production by 70% to meet the demand by 2050. So it's really fundamentally important that we don't waste what we're already growing.
Right.
We've got to get the best use that we can from that. And if we can use that as an empowerment tool to give these local communities a means to create and earn wealth or value and redistribute, rebalance that value chain, reduce the food miles, reduce the power per ton, these are all pros, and then also the added valorization of using these extra waste materials to create further value. That's kind of how we see our virtuous circle.
Yeah, and just to dig into that a little bit, so we talked earlier at the beginning about historically these large rice mills can afford the latest technology. They're doing a ton of output. Now they might not be doing it in a cost conscious way or an environmentally conscious way, but they're just focused on in and out production, high volume, right?
Yeah. And
the small and medium sized rice mills have struggled because they cannot afford that, technology. They struggle to create that output, et cetera. So by leveraging the as a service model, you're equalizing that competition a bit, right? You're making it possible for those small and medium-sized businesses to invest in the latest and greatest technology in the same way that the large companies could. And then that gives them the opportunity to, improve their output, improve their value creation without, that challenge of not being able to afford that capital expenditure. I don't know if you're willing to share this example, but I know you told me when we spoke that you have had folks ask you to buy the equipment outright, and you have not allowed that to happen. Can you talk about that and why that is?
Rice industry is very large, but it's also very small. So I think my feeling is we believe and are committed to our business model. The easy option for us right now would be perhaps to sell some machines to big companies and just bank some money. But I think once we do that, we kind of shot ourselves in the foot, and then trying to introduce the model will become significantly harder.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tough, and you have to have persistence and belief, belligerence maybe. But
Mm-hmm.
we have a unique technology; it's patented, and so you can only get it from us, and we want to make it available to those that can. Perhaps the best impact is going to be with the smaller consumers. If you think about a lot, if we're looking at Africa in particular, or even rural India, you've got infrastructure problems. These big mills require lots of rice. So that means you've got to truck that rice in for miles and miles.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the States, they've got good road systems, great trucks. It's not a problem. In Africa, it's a major problem. They don't have the road infrastructure to haul that rice. So many of these large mills that have been built are not running at anything near their capacity because they physically can't get enough rice to them to keep them going. Now, again, if you look at the macroeconomics here, Africa should be self-sufficient in rice, yet imports enormous quantities of rice to replace rice they already have because they don't have the physical capability to process that rice to an acceptable standard for the consumer. Therefore, the consumer would rather pay a price premium to buy imported rice rather than local rice. So if we can increase the capability of these rural millers, and bearing in mind, going back to the macro, sorry to jump about, but of 750 million tons of rice that's grown each year, maybe 40 million tons will be traded as an export commodity.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the rice is grown and consumed in a very tight locality.
Mm-hmm.
So by improving that capability in a distributed local sense at a high performance level, then you don't need to be trucking that rice. Because bear in mind, if you truck that rice out to process it, you've got to truck it back in to the people who grew it in the first place so they can buy it back their own rice at an inflated price.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or they have to live with the very poor quality rice that the current capability can deliver.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of transformative impact we can have in those rural communities. And it's really about, the large mills have a place, they have good performance levels, but we can put those smaller mills into a position where they can actually exceed the performance capabilities of the large mills. And of course, the way energy prices are going right now, the reduction in power is significant. It's really important. Even for the big customers now, it's going to become really significant.
Yeah. I think there's so many interesting aspects to the story, and I think you will see those large companies have more interest. It just maybe isn't, the first line of opportunity, but I think it will definitely come, right? I think your commitment to the business model, though, is commendable, not only because you believe strongly in it, but also the way you perceive it as an ability to sort of democratize innovation, so that those small and medium-sized businesses have it just as accessible to them as it would be to the large companies, and because you believe in and understand its impact on the environment, right? So it's it's a really cool story and a really commendable remit that you are committed to, focused on, being patient in seeing come to fruition. So I just think there's a lot to learn from this, both in in a lot of ways. You are a really good example of the disruption that's coming, right? I mean, people need to be aware of that and be thinking about it. Those big companies that are struggling to get away from, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, I mean, maybe not, because somebody, or somebody is going to come up with a different idea that, is going to change the game. So, okay, we talked a little bit about the impact on the environment, and I just want to kind of recap there. So there's the less power consumption of the machines themselves, less waste. We talked about building the machines for serviceability versus upfront cost. We talked about the impact of being able to get this equipment into some of these rural communities and minimize travel, maximize, the opportunity for the local workforce, et cetera. Am I missing anything from an environmental standpoint that we should touch on?
No, I think the environment, obviously the way the world's going at the moment with the increase in temperature. I mean, one of the interesting stats is that for every 1 degree increase in overnight temperature reduces field yields by 10% for rice. So, everything is a perfect storm at the moment. There's more demand and there's more problems about producing. So, one of the things that we work with a partner company. They can take a husk and they use pyrolysis to make power or heat and power. And one of the aspects of that is biochar. And if we mix that biochar with manure and then reincorporate it in the ground as a natural ground improver, so it displaces chemical fertilizers. Again, with the Ukraine situation, there's a massive cost hike in chemical fertilizers right now. But one customer we were talking to in Nigeria had done a sort of build at home biochar unit and had some really impressive results. So he'd increased his field yield from 2.5 tons to 4 tons per hectare. But more importantly, when the drought hit, his rice didn't die because the carbon in the ground actually holds the water better. Now so we can mitigate carbon release by reducing the power, but you can also carbon capture that biochar reinterred in the ground becomes effectively a carbon capture process. So that opens up potential of carbon credits, trading credits and carbon. So these are all additional things that go into that value generation pot. And I think that's the key. Now, we just picking up on one of your earlier points. I think we are a family business. We're driven by our visions and value. So that gives us a lot of freedom to do things that perhaps bigger companies can't do. But we are a for-profit company. We're not trying to save the world. Our intentions are to make a highly profitable, high-growth global business. But from a company that we call it profit with purpose. We have a positive impact socially, economically, and environmentally. So why not make money from doing something good rather than making money from something that's destroying our environment? So that's kind of our drivers.
Yeah. And it's a great point because I think that, there's increasing recognition that you can do both, right? I mean, doing good for your customers and the world and these local communities and the environment does not have to mean that you sacrifice being a profitable business, right? It's the same way we talked about the difference in how you sell this. It's building partnerships, right? Correct. So it is creating mutually beneficial relationships with an eye toward what's the social impact, what's the environmental impact, right? And working to achieve that with the partners that you have that choose to work with you, right? So, I think that is a really good point because, I wouldn't want someone to hear your story and think that you're just a philanthropic organization. I mean, it has the potential to do good, and to make Koolmill money. So it's not either or, it's and both, right? And so I think that's a good distinction.
So we would say we're not in this driven by money. We're in this driven by our technology has impact to make, and if we do a semi-reasonable job, the money will come. But that's the way around. So we're certainly not in the Bill Gates league. So we're not philanthropic investors. Let's put it that way. But I think it's the old adage: if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach him to fish, he's fed for life. And so it's really about this empowerment and that release of that human capital that's frustrated right now. Because if you look at Africa or India or any of the Asian rural communities, it's all about human capital. Agriculture is such a massive part of their GDP, but they don't have any way of adding value, and that tends to be done sometimes out of country. So we're exporting all that value. How can we try and retain that value and drive up that standard of living in that country. That's our key.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Alec, in closing, for anyone that is, looking at the as a service model and considering its potential, whether they're a new venture or an existing entity, any other, lessons learned or words of wisdom that you would share?
Yeah, I've got lots of lessons, not all, some of them painful. I'm not sure about the words of wisdom. I think you have to understand your end user, your customer, if you want to use that word. So you have to understand their business and what's the business case for them. How do you explain? If you can't explain the business case, you're not going to get anywhere. And I think when we look at the potential customers that we could have worked with, it's really important that you pick the visionary ones. Some people have that visionary capability. They can see where they want to go. And some people are just trying to get through today. And we're not really worried about tomorrow. So I think that initial choice and who you're going to partner with to develop the model, because it is a development process. You can't just get one off the shelf and say, well, that worked for Rolls-Royce, therefore we'll just copy that in Koolmill, and then somebody's come along, well, it worked in Koolmill, we can just copy that and do the same. You can follow the principles, but you need to adapt and deploy it to suit your particular product or industry or what have you.
Right.
One size certainly doesn't fit all. But really, if you don't understand that value you're creating for the end user, then you're on a loser. And if you can't shift your mindset away from what you were doing, don't look at the past, look at what's possible now. Look at all the instrumentation that's available. Can I deploy that to create value? If it can't create value, what's the point? Big data. What's the point of big data? It's just a lot of data. Is there any gold nuggets in there that you can pull out and monetize? Because if you can't, then it's just nice to have, but it's not valuable.
Right.
So these are the key aspects, I think. And be patient and if you're not the senior management, you need to get that senior management buy-in. There has to be a fundamental commitment in the company. This is where we're going, because this will create substantial revenue beyond where we are now. And that protects the future of the company.
Yeah. Really good. Great stuff. I love the story. I appreciate you coming and spending some time with me and sharing it with me and with our audience. And would definitely love to stay in touch and have you back sometime to hear how it's going.
That'd be great. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been great chatting. Absolutely.
You can learn more about servitization and the path to as a service by visiting us at futureoffieldservice.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn as well as Twitter at The Future of FS. The Future of Field Service podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more at ifs.com. As always, thank you for listening.